Welcome back to another episode of Wharton Tech Talks. I'm Zoe, and today, Monsi and I are joined by Americus Reed, the Whitney M. Young Jr. Professor of Marketing at the Wharton School.
Professor Reed's work specializes in brand equity and identity loyalty, in which he studies how brand communities form around consumers' levels of symbolic identity and self-expression. Among a very impressive list of accolades, Professor Reed received the 2023 Distinguished Scientific Contribution Award from the Society for Consumer Psychology and the 2023 Steinkamp Long-Term Impact Award from the International Journal of Research and Marketing. He is also the author of The Handbook of Research on Identity Theory and Marketing, which really distills the impacts of identity on consumer behavior and consumption. At Wharton, among other courses, he has taught consumer behavior as well as dynamic marketing strategy, and also hosts his own podcast called Marketing Matters.
Welcome to the podcast, Professor Reed. We're really excited to learn more about you and your research and how it all relates to the tech space.
Well, you're not more excited than I am. I appreciate you both and super excited to have this conversation.
Awesome. Well, let's get started. I know Monsi touched a little bit on your background in the introduction, but I just wanted to dive in a little bit more into that. So I know you studied business at Georgia State, and then you went on to do 2 different master's degrees as well as your PhD, where you were focusing on marketing and social psychology. So could you tell us a little bit more about how you developed this interest and what drew you to those industries and areas?
Yeah, I think that I was super interested in the idea of figuring out who I was. And so as I was sort of navigating early childhood and figuring out what is my place in the social world through high school and all of these different things, it became very clear to me that how a person navigates their identity and their sense of self in a world that allows them to create a set of pillars that can guide their behaviors, thoughts, actions, and feelings was something that super interested in me because I was going through that journey myself and trying to ask and answer those types of questions. So when I came to realize that there's an interface between social psychology and studying a sense of self, a sense of identity, a sense of connection with the world, and how that interface is with the way that consumers use products, brands, services, and organizations, I found this really nice intersection of trying to understand how the self evolves in the context of developing in a world where products and services can become part of who you are and can become a way to express something that's important to the world and that's important to yourself. So if you look at, I think, some of the greatest brands in the world, the iconic brands that exist out there, many of them have this sort of DNA, that is to say that they have made somehow a connection between a sense of a consumer's identity and the stuff that they create. And so I think that's a very powerful premise to say that we can create something that's really cool, let's say, and it can be anything. It can be a service. It can be something in the high tech space. It can be software. It can be whatever. And it can make a connection, an emotional connection by helping a consumer self-define. And so I wanted to figure out, is there a way to understand how that strategy should be laid out on day 0? Say, for example, if you're working with a startup or you're trying to create something from scratch, could you build into your strategy ideas, topics, understandings from the scientific literature that would allow you to create that kind of deeper, self-expressive, identity-relevant sort of community? So that's been something I've been studying since I went to do my PhD in 1995, and I haven't stopped studying it since. I think the bad news is that I ask these questions and try to answer them, and what ends up is I just come up with more questions to try to answer. So it's been a really fun journey, and I'm excited to share some of these learnings with you all today.
Absolutely. And thanks for the background around, how you came across your path in your PhD. Are there any elements of your dissertation or some of your research during that program that you'd love to share?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that became very clear is that there's an opportunity for startups, companies, tech companies, anybody, people. There's an opportunity to create this kind of deep emotional connection early on. And so one of the things that we understood is the principle of a consumer and their multidimensionality. And one of the things I studied in my dissertation is how does a person figure out these various, we call them roles, various identities that people might have, and how do they navigate, how do they connect these identities to different activities and behaviors that they can become internalized and focused on as developing their sense of self, and how do the products fit into that? And so there's a couple of things that came out of my dissertation. One is that you have these different multidimensionalities of who you are. So for example, I'm a father, I'm a professor, I'm a musician, I'm an entrepreneur with a lowercase e, and I'm a fitness enthusiast. I have all these different aspects about who I am. And as I develop these different identities, I'm trying to figure out what are the things that I can do or engage with in the world that can unlock that potential. And so the first important premise of the dissertation that I was studying was that there is this sort of fluidity of your sense of self. So this multidimensionality has a lot of heterogeneity in it with respect to these different components of who you are. And that changes over the course of the day and certainly over the course of the lifetime. So the notion of an identity becoming salient. So when I was sitting in Wharton graduation yesterday, it was exciting because my professorial identity was highly salient. I was wearing the regalia. I was with colleagues, MBA students, and we were all in that moment. But at that moment, the salience of that specific identity and all of the attributes that defined me in that particular role were highly activated. And so as I navigate and change role, come home and I'm with my daughter. Now I'm in my daddy identity. I have a different kind of personality. So the point is that my dissertation talks about if companies are smart, if they understand this heterogeneity, because this multidimensionality about a consumer sense of who they are can lead companies to be able to say, we can create something, we can create a service, a brand, a product, and things like that match these identities that a person has. So the beautiful thing about it from a business perspective is that every single person in the world is kind of a walking set of target markets because they have all of this heterogeneity and multidimensionality in who they are. So the job of the market and the job of the business is to understand these different dimensions and then to create something that can emotionally connect with one of them. So that was sort of what my dissertation tried to lay out as a kind of strategy based on that premise of having studied identity from a social psychological perspective.
Yeah, it makes sense that all of those things would kind of link together and come back to have such an important impact in kind of a consumer marketing sense. So I wanted to actually kind of flip the discussion and talk a little bit more about competitors versus consumers. One thing that you discuss quite a bit in your dynamic marketing strategy class is the different types of competitors. So thinking about direct competitors, competitors who might be solving different problems in a similar way, vice versa, competitors who are solving the same problem in different ways, and competitors who might be focused on a distinct product category altogether. So I think most companies, when they're building a product and developing a strategy, they're focused on that first category of direct consumers. But do you think that there's another category that is often maybe ignored or has a greater potential to impact strategy overall?
I think the answer to those questions are yes and yes. It's very, it's interesting because I wouldn't say that they're ignoring them per se, ignoring these other aspects of the competitive landscape per se. What I would say is that it's not easy necessarily to observe and think in that sort of way, to be able to open up the mental possibilities of the true set of potential competitors that exist out there. So yes, you're 100% correct, Zoe. The idea that there is someone else most likely who's going to be making something very similar to what you make in terms of the functional features. Yes, that's true. That's what you referred to as direct competition. However, if you expand your viewpoint, you say, and you think more from a sociological point of view to say, listen, what is this thing? And it could be like a super high tech product. What is this thing? What is it unlocking? What is the underlying need? And once you have that kind of deeper kind of sociological understanding, then the picture of potential competition will open up, right? So for example, if you're trying to get someone to sit down and listen to your podcast at certain times of the day, let's say, and you're in that space and you're thinking about, well, okay, I do a podcast, Tech Talk podcast, you might be thinking, okay, well, I compete with other podcasts that are doing similar kinds of content. Yes, that's true in terms of direct competition, but you're also competing with Netflix. You're also competing with drive-in movie theaters, and you're competing with the broader space of potential competitors who are trying to fill that entertainment need or informational need or educational need. You're competing with online educational courses. So you expand your mindset to say, okay, what is the full array, not just the direct competitors, but the full array of competition based on truly understanding what is this consumer? Why is this consumer what job is being understood by consuming my particular product? What job's to be done? What am I actually achieving for this particular person? And if you unpack that sociologically, you will immediately see that the world is open to all of these other things that will be competing for that finite time, effort, and energy and money of that consumer.
That's really helpful, and particularly appreciate, understanding at a more granular level what matters to the consumer and how can that help us find competitors that aren't necessarily in that direct category. I was curious if there are methodologies or approaches that help actually create those comparison points at a more detailed level. So actually measuring, this competitor really has strength in this category, and here's how we can maybe even quantify the level of that strength, maybe approaches that are used in the marketing world.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot. One of the things that we always take a look at is, well, there's two types of intelligence you can create. One is primary information that you collect yourself. The other is secondary information that might be out there. So there's lots of different reports you can just outright purchase that help you understand a marketplace or a set of competitive landscapes and things of that nature. So someone has, in many cases, actually done some research that you can get access to. That's where I always sort of say, you always start with something you can go to and sort of get off the shelf, whether it's, doing some sort of Google search or going to the library or buying industry reports or getting access to industry reports, things like that. That's sort of the first step. Then the second step is this sort of primary research that you do yourself in the instances where the secondary research doesn't allow you to answer the questions fully that you would like to try to answer. So of course, we have sort of quantitative surveys that we can do that, where we can look at how will customers respond to a product concept, what specific competitive product services are they already using and why, and then thinking about where do I fit in terms of my particular value proposition in this specific space. What need am I going to fill? What am I going to be able to do that's better than what's already out there? How am I going to be able to get people to switch, and so on and so forth? One of the big techniques, though, that I've talked about a lot, which I think is an also interesting primary research approach, is this notion of social listening. And that is to say that you're out there, and there's lots of tools to do this in terms of social media platforms, but going out there and it's like a digital sociological exercise. It's sort of like Jane Goodall in the Jungle, but the digital version, where you're out there. What are people saying about products, services, organizations, brands? What are they saying about the needs that they have that aren't being filled? And you can do this on Reddit, Twitter, or X, I guess it's called now. All these different Instagram, all these different things are sort of an open channel to consumers communicating the things that they like, the things that they don't like, the things that they need, the gaps that need to be filled, and all of this kind of stuff. So I always say start with this notion of social listening, customer centricity, going to the consumers initially and trying to hear what they're saying about that particular domain or product category. And that's where you can pick up these little nuggets of intel that allow you to say, well, hey, there's something amiss in this particular space that I can potentially create something that will fill that need. The thing that I love about social listening is that it's an unobtrusive way to get intelligence about the marketplace. When you do a survey, you get a sample and you write a survey and they give you answers and you analyze these specific quantitative answers, with things like regression and things like that, techniques of other sorts of statistical modeling sorts of techniques. But the beautiful thing about social listening is that you're just sort of out there listening and you're not intruding. You're not trying to tell them what to think. You're trying to hear them, consumers, as they express their pain points. And you're trying to understand what are the things that are out there that are trying to address these pain points and why are there gaps and how can I potentially fill those gaps? So those are some of the tools. This is a whole, again, you can make an entire career out of studying consumers and quote consumer insights. And there's tons and tons of tools that you can employ to try to get at those learnings that would then allow you to create something that's viable. And I think, in startups and also in the corporate world, it's often tricky because when you're trying to talk to consumers, you're trying to think about what are their needs, but you're also trying to develop and not get too ahead of your skis. The problem with a lot of companies is that they'll go make something and they haven't asked the question of, okay, what's the need? What's the job to be done that's being filled here? The need. What am I actually creating and how is this need going to be fit with by this particular thing that I'm creating, this product, this service, or whatever? And they first build it and they're excited about building it. And they build this app or they build this piece of tech or they build this software or whatever. And they haven't asked, well, who is this for? And why will they desperately need this as opposed to something else? And so what we try to do is we try to make sure that we do this sort of top-down approach where we think about the consumer first and we listen to what she is saying, and then we try to develop things that fit those needs in a very much different way than what's existing that's out there.
And that provides a really great segue into the consumer base. And, I think a major element of marketing seems to be actually segmenting the consumer base. And I know coming from an investing background, you'll often hear companies say, well, we focus on the SMB market or the enterprise customer market, or we segment based on active users versus once in a while users. So I was curious, what are some mistakes or errors that you feel companies make in regards to how they go about categorizing their consumers and ways they can improve in that process?
Yeah, this is a great question. And this is one of the reasons why identity is such an important sociological construct to study. And it's because that the notion of understanding how a person sees themselves, who they are, and who they want to be is the underlying premise for all of segmentation. So the idea that I say, I want to be able to understand who is this person at a deep granular level so I can create something that will fit seamlessly into their life and bring them utility in consuming that stuff or that thing. And so there's lots of different, and so then that opens up the question of, well, how should I categorize a consumer? And there's lots of different ways to do that. You just listed a few kind of interesting categories, but we as marketers make up these categories, right? So in some sense, it's sort of like, okay, we could say we could put you in an age bucket and say you're of a particular type of generation and use that as a way to categorize people. Or we could say, like you just said, heavy versus light users or things like that. I think the big mistake that people make is that corporations, strategists, things like that. A huge mistake is that they try to characterize, or they end up, let's say, categorizing consumers based on attributes, based on descriptions that don't matter in terms of how the consumer actually makes a decision about buying something in a specific product category. So while I agree with the idea that, we want to, so for example, use a kind of loose description, let's take age, for example, young consumers, right? Gen Z, I understand that means something in terms of defining an age range. And that's useful as a kind of metaphor to think about what do young people kind of on average want in the marketplace. But it's a big mistake to sort of say that, okay, a specific, let's say, age cohort is going to be treated as if they all act the same way based on this sort of arbitrary distinction of their age range. Because I think that's an example of a huge mistake because you're missing the heterogeneity of all these other ways that they might describe themselves that actually might be much more correlated to what they would actually end up doing and buying and wanting in the marketplace. So I try to counsel startups, corporations, people, everybody that always start with, okay, let me sit down and define this customer demographically, certainly in terms of age and socioeconomics, region where they are, things like that, these kinds of basic race, ethnicity, blah, blah, blah. Yes, but also add that to that, let's say, an understanding about other sort of lifestyle things that they might be interested in, hobbies, interests, attitudes, beliefs, ideologies, these kinds of things, which we refer to as psychographics. You need both. You need a demographic sort of characterization of your consumer, and you need a psychographic characterization of your consumer. The psychographics, in my opinion, is more important because the psychographics tell you more about the types of things that they might be interested in and the wants and needs that they might have. And the demographics, you still need those things because the demographics allow you to find these people based on sort of their outward, external characteristics. But the psychographics are super important too in terms of defining and really illustrating and articulating their specific psychological lifestyles and things that they're into. So the great companies are the ones that are able to identify those lifestyle sorts of things and then tie in an understanding of these psychographic sorts of determinants of segmentation and then going all in on a specific type of consumer. But my point, this is great because it's making the point again. The idea is that you have to do this work. You have to sit there and go deep in and become super obsessed with your customer, understanding everything about her or him and understanding all of these different aspects. And then once you build this picture, demographic, psychographic, all of these different things, where do they shop? What do they do? All these things things about their life in a broader sort of sociological picture, then you're able to understand, okay, now once I have that sort of articulated, then I can start thinking about, well, what should this service be, this product, this thing that I want to actually build, and how do I build it specifically tailored to that consumer insight sort of analysis.
I want to kind of dig even further into this topic. So one thing that I've been thinking a little bit about is it totally makes sense to me to include that psychographic element into your strategy and how you're developing a product even from the beginning. But what about when you're thinking about selling not necessarily to an individual, but maybe to a corporation or a larger entity? So for example, Calendly, the scheduling application, they have plenty of individual consumers, but they also license their product out to offices and larger companies. Same thing you could say about maybe like Amazon Web Services. They're selling not only to individual engineers, but maybe also to banks and larger companies who are using that service. So how can you go about thinking about maybe these less demographic type of traits and these more psychographic elements, but if it's not for an individual, if it's for a larger group or corporation?
I love that question, Zoe, because the same logic still applies. If you think about it, in the enterprise setting, it's actually, I would argue that it's actually a little bit easier in the sense that you have at these various corporations, you have decision makers who would be the ones that you have to convince that this web service, this app, this platform, this software is going to be useful for them deploying to their constituents and their, let's say, employees in that particular organization. And to me, that's actually easier because in some senses, if you understand and can identify this decision maker identity, watch this now, you're actually trying to figure out, like, what is it about this person who is making this decision to deploy specific resources to their company? At the end of the day, their job is to make themselves look really good in front of their boss, essentially. So they're looking for ways to buttress their own identity as a key decision maker in that organization. So if you know that and you understand that and can identify these decision makers, then you can kind of tailor what it is that you're going to say you'd like to help them deploy inside their corporations in exactly the same way that would exist at the individual consumer level. But in terms of the enterprise level, you actually have, there's a lot less of these people, but they're probably easier to identify because of the nature of their job as being sort of the gatekeeper to deciding what sorts of products get deployed in those specific corporate environments. So in some senses, the exercise is actually a little bit easier because they're sort of easy to identify, easy, quote, in air quotes, easy to identify. But I think the whole point in that specific manifestation of this, Zoe, is to say that I need to understand, let's imagine Zoe is the key deployment officer, decision maker at Amazon for a specific set, or Corporation X, let's say, for a specific, let's say, function. I need to understand like your day-to-day operations. What are you doing? How are you trying to do your job to become more efficient, a better leader? That's another thing, leadership identity, all these different things in your life in that specific multidimensional aspect of your professional identity. I need to understand that process of how you engage with others in your employment situation as a key decision maker for these types of services. And if I can understand that from a relationship perspective, I'm better equipped to be able to present you with a value proposition that would connect with these aspects of your decision-making identity that would resonate with you. So in some senses, it's the exact same logic. It's just happening at a smaller scale. And in my view, at a scale that is a little bit easier to get your hands around because you understand that space. And there aren't a whole lot of, let's say, folks that are, it's not like the mass market of consumers where you're trying to figure out the granularity. You actually can identify these people and move forward from that point of view. Does that make sense?
It does. I think, especially when you touched on that point about leadership as an identity. And I think that's something I've talked about quite a bit in some of my past work experience. Like, how can we position ourselves as a leader in a certain area by aligning our actions with our goals? So it makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
And I am curious, I think generally when we think about marketing and customer segmentation and identity loyalty, we often think of consumer-focused brands and, traditional CPG, maybe retail, everything direct to consumer. Have you noticed any B2B companies or industries broadly on the B2B side that have really done a good job on all these fronts? And another way of asking the question is, do you feel like there are industries aside from consumer that have really thrived by leveraging these identity loyalty and better customer segmentation concepts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you can pick the most, let's say, the most iconic brands and services and technologies that are out there. And if you unpack them sociologically, you can probably find some element of identity loyalty that's built into those concepts. So one of the companies I talk about all the time is Tesla, because it's an incredible kind of remarkable thing to be able to say that, here is this electric vehicle and here is this incredible community of people who love it or not or hate it, they are into this thing. And so, when you look at tech, and that's the way you should look at technology. You never look at technology as just only filling a need to get something functionally done, right? Driving you from point A to point B. That's what an electric vehicle can do. But the point is that if you understand how you can connect into that emotional sort of vision, let's say, then you're able to do something much more powerful. So, for example, if you're Elon Musk and you're trying to take your technology to the world and not just to the end consumer, which they've been doing pretty well at, but also to other businesses, let's say, who may want to use electric vehicles as part of their logistics and things of that nature, then you're building in this sort of brand, if you will. You're building in this sort of psychological gravitational pull that has a lot to do with the vision of the company, and not just the fact that it's a vehicle that can get you from point A to point B in a different kind of fuel sort of related way. So every single great company that you can name has some element of this sort of, I understand these consumers and I'm going to create some kind of connection, maybe even a cult. If you look at it in the Tesla case, where people are just so into this, it can't just be about the stuff. It has to be about something different and at a higher level in terms of creating a connection and a relationship. And in a B2B setting, enterprise setting, the great companies, understand that the reason why this is powerful is because the technology itself, in many cases, is pretty easy to copy. So if you just create technology that doesn't have any protection around some runway of patented secret sauce, then at some point, someone's just going to copy what you're doing and try to, basically come into play and say, well, I've got a cheaper version of this or a different version. And if people are not bought into that brand, they may switch because the only reason they're with you is because of the features. So the whole point of this is, especially for tech companies, is to figure out, how can I create a stronger relationship with what I'm doing and the tribe or the community of people who would self-express through this thing and create a kind of natural group of people who are so into it that, say, for example, with Tesla, I don't ever have to even do a commercial. I've never done a commercial. There is no Tesla commercial. People don't, if you think about that, that's remarkable that you can get someone to actually get 300,000 people to give you some money to get in a line to wait for something they've never seen before in real life. And it's like that, it's that kind of bizarre, it's what, I don't want to use the word bizarre because I don't want to I don't want to poison the well here, but it's not rational. But that's sort of the beauty of it is like, well, why are you so into this? Why are you willing to wait and pay money for, this thing? It's because I believe in this particular company's vision, not just the tech, but the vision of let's say the founder, for example, Elon Musk. I believe in his vision as a futurist, and therefore, because as a futurist, I want to get a little piece of that magic by participating in being in the Tesla community. And that works, by the way. They're making the exact same argument at the B2B level when they're trying to sell like fleets of electric vehicles into different organizations for logistics purposes and things of that nature. The same magic is going to be part of that value proposition that eventually drives people to want to buy what it is that you're doing. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you so much for that.
So you've mentioned before that you've worked with a few different tech startups to help them optimize their marketing and branding. I'm wondering if you have any examples that you can share that kind of put together all of these different concepts that we've just been discussing. So some of the psychographic segmentation, some of thinking about identity and how that can best match with a vision for a customer, anything else we've discussed as well.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I'll mention two startups that I'm involved with here that I think play out in terms of many of the discussion that we've had thus far. The first is a very interesting startup by a Wharton alum, Alan Frost, and it's a company called Flavonaturals. And basically, the big idea is to create a health and wellness, quote, performance chocolate that really allows you to take advantage of the power of cocoa flavanols as an antioxidant for health and wellness. And so it was interesting to work with them to try to figure out, okay, we got to tell a different story about chocolate. Chocolate is usually defined as a hedonic kind of thing, but yet in the world out there, we see that there are people who are desiring to sort of want to be doing healthy things, but not give up the fun, pleasurable stuff that they have in their life. So one thing to think about in a performance-based chocolate is to how do you tell a story for a brand like Flava Naturals to be able to tap into a kind of health and wellness identity, but also a kind of chocolate lover's identity as well. And so create a product that will live in both worlds, that can sort of walk that fine line between pleasure and wellness, that can speak to a lot of different people. And so helping them kind of go through that segmentation exercise was a lot of fun when they first started building their company and their products, because they wanted to understand, well, where do we fit in the context of other protein bars or other different types of, quote, supplements that people take for health and wellness, and what type of consumer would be interested in kind of doing something healthy, but also doing something hedonic. So trying to understand that duality in a consumption decision-making market is sort of what they've been charged to try to do to be a successful company. So one of the things that they did was they started creating different product lines that can differentially fit different dimensions of health and wellness, but also different dimensions of fun and hedonism, if you will. So one of the things that they did is they created kind of a chocolate bar version of their product and kind of a pure cocoa powder version of their product for different types of consumers that would be interested in disproportionately different aspects of getting a little bit of a health and wellness bump from their product, and also getting a little bit of pleasure and fun and chocolate fun from their products as well. And so what's interesting about that is, as their brand develops, they have this duality of trying to straddle that fence of healthy, but also really good for you, and figuring out how to talk to consumers in a way that builds into their lifestyles and things like that. And I think what's interesting about it is that all of this is actually based heavily in the science around cocoa flavanols and that particular component's ability to create all kinds of memory benefits and health and wellness brain benefits and things of that nature that are heavily documented in the actual scientific literature if you go look at it. So the question then becomes, how do I tell a story about science but also fun that gets people to do something that's a bit more healthy for themselves, but also doesn't make them turn into this person who's trying to do something that's never fun and never enjoying life and all of this kind of stuff. Because there are a lot of people out there who want to do healthy things, but they don't want to give up the fun things in life as well. So how do you create that sort of product in the Flava Naturals brand that can speak to that and create resonance and really place that product in a specific type of positioning? So that's been a cool startup that we worked with. And in fact, they come into my class and we sort of tell the story in my class, and the students further help to sort of develop the logic and thinking behind that specific product. I've also been interested in working with a very interesting startup called Somatics, Somatix. This is a little bit different because they are a gesture detection software platform. And what they do is they have specialized algorithms that, when built into wearing your fitness wearable, these algorithms can basically detect what you're doing, let's say. So in terms of your movements, right? So most wearables will do, things like steps and heart rate variability, oxygen saturation, things like that. And this particular software platform does all of those kinds of things. But the cool thing about this specific software platform, Somatics, is that it has this specialized gesture detection that can tell you, did you take your pill? How much did you drink? Based on the movement of your hand and your wearable, to sort of detect and estimate and forecast the things that you're doing that could be correlated with healthy or unhealthy behavior. So in that specific context, that sort of value proposition is meant more for situations to sell into. This is the enterprise idea, selling into like assisted living, nursing homes, things like that, where it's actually a huge value proposition to be able to, watch this, to empower the nurse and what he or she is doing to working with patients so that the gesture detection algorithms and the technology allow you to be a better caretaker, a more efficient caretaker, because you can monitor through a dashboard what people are doing in those settings. And again, it's interesting because gesture detection there are a lot of different use cases for gesture detection. But one of the things that Somatics made a decision about in conversations and working with me and my team is that there's a big need for this in assisted living sorts of settings and nursing homes and hospitals, because you need the tech to be able to understand what patients are doing for pressure injuries and all kinds of different things that could be happening, where the nurses, the healthcare providers, can't be there physically looking at them 24/7, but can monitor through gesture detection, algorithmic technology, all kinds of signals that would be outcomes that could potentially point to problems that you can fix before they actually happen. So using sort of machine learning and this notion of gesture detection prediction to be able to intervene before bad things happen in a healthcare environment is actually a pretty cool mission for this specific company called Somatics. So again, the exact two very different things, like performance chocolate and gesture detection technology. But in both cases, the exact same top-down customer analysis process is defining who is this person, what are their multidimensional aspects, whether it be someone who wants health and wellness and still wants to have a pleasurable life, versus what are the healthcare workers doing and needing to have their needs met for jobs to be done in these sort of assisted living and nursing home settings, but still thinking through, how do I develop this proposition and understanding their life so that I can tell a story that will resonate with them as really creating something that helps with their needs, that then allows the product or the technology to be seen as very useful and desirable. So again, it doesn't matter whether or not you're talking about B2B, B2C, personal brands. It's all the exact same exercise, which is unpacking the consumer. What is he or she like? What are their needs? How do I position a value proposition that connects with their identity and your understanding of their desire for self-expression and the multidimensionality of their life? And how do I then create something that's perceived as emotionally connecting with them and that creates a brand that resonates in some aspect of the self-expression that they want to have, that then creates this level of community and identity loyalty so that they want to stick with me through the evolution of the things that I'm doing, because I'm connecting them with them, not just on the ability to do stuff in terms of utilitarian functional features, but also in terms of the ability to help them reinforce or reaffirm a specific sense of identity that they want to have.
Great. Well, these insights have been really valuable. Thank you so much for the examples. And especially with Somatics, I wasn't familiar with that one, and cool to see how they're leveraging all of these concepts to also create a good behavioral nudge and clearly really good impact for the consumer base. Great. Well, we usually transition at the end of each podcast to a couple of fun rapid fire questions. And so I'll pass it to Zoe to kick those off.
Sure. So before, you mentioned one of your kind of key identifiers is that you are very interested in health and wellness. So I wanted to know, what's your favorite sort of health food spot in the Philadelphia area?
Oh, good question. Health food spot. Ooh, that's interesting. I mean, obviously I'm a Whole Foods kind of a guy. And so this is a whole different conversation because, I'm super interested in nutrition, and I've been studying kind of metabolic dysfunction and trying to understand it. So I'm trying to find really good places that allow me to do that. There's a really interesting place called Raw, RAW, that I like a lot, that has a lot of sort of cold pressed juices and some other sorts of things that are highly non-processed. So I would say probably right now, this restaurant Raw is sort of at the top of my list in terms of really cool places to hang out and get some nutrition, and that also is really good for me.
Great. And kind of on a similar vein, I remember in class, we learned that you are quite the early bird with your, I believe it was 2 a.m. wake up time. So
Yes.
I am curious, do you have a morning routine that really helps you gear up for the day and be the best version of yourself?
100%. I have a morning routine for sure. I get up. First thing I do is I thank the universe for another opportunity to thrive and have a good day. I do a lot of gratitude journaling. I do meditation in the morning. I try to connect with nature and sunlight in the morning. Then I go work out. And then after I work out, I do cold showers and hot soaks And I prepare for the day by really reflecting on who I am and how do I want to show up in the world on that specific day. And I go through my entire calendar and make sure that whatever it is that I'm working on is an opportunity to reaffirm those different things. So I definitely have a routine, and I always make my bed. That's actually another thing, which is super important. It's the first little thing that you can complete at the beginning of the day, or in that first list of things that you do in the day that sort of set the tone. And the whole idea being that this is from a commencement speech that I saw where the person speaking said, if you make your bed, it's that first little victory that you have for the day that sets the tone. It really is sort of this idea of like, if I can handle the little things, if I can be consistent with the little details, then I can certainly be consistent with the big details and the harder stuff. And if you make your bed, even if you have the crappiest day in the world, when you come home that night, you have a made bed. So I have a whole routine, and my focus right now at this stage of my life is really those 9 things of nature, sunlight, love, family, friendships, self-care, nutrition, and sleep. And focused on like really making sure that I'm asking the right questions about what is it I want my soul to express to the world, and how do I go about living every moment in that purpose as I navigate my day-to-day activities. Sorry, this is supposed to be rapid fire, but I'm rambling on here, so I apologize.
Nice. I don't know if I could commit to waking up at 2 a.m. every day, but maybe making the bed is an easier one to start with.
Yeah, that's a good place to start.
Yeah. What magazines or books do you currently have on your coffee table right now?
Ooh, so right now I am reading a couple of books. One is a book called Outlive by Peter Attia. It's a book about longevity and staving off metabolic dysfunction and things of that nature, which is a really cool read. I'm reading that. I'm also reading a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces by Joseph Campbell, which is about a really interesting analysis of the journey of life. And basically the book is about the 17 steps of the journey of life and the hero's journey that seems to permeate like hundreds of cultures. It's the same story that we all go through that is really a common set of themes. And so I'm reading that particular book right now because I want to understand how it applies to the journey that I'm on right now in terms of my life. But it's those 2 books that I'm reading right now that are sort of my read for fun stuff when I'm not reading literature and articles from the scientific world.
Great. And what's your boldest prediction for the tech and marketing space in the next decade, even if it seems totally crazy and out there for most of the people in industry or academia?
Yeah, I think we live in a world of cycles. So I think right now I'm paying very much close attention to our descent as consumers, our descent into tech, as being careful about not losing our humanity. So I'm predicting that at some point there's going to be a sort of counter reaction to all of the tech that is, I don't want to say invading our lives, but is becoming a huge part of our lives in terms of generative AI and all of these different sorts of things. I think at some point, humanity is going to react and say, we need to get a bit back more to humanity and real connections, real people, being together and connecting with each other in a way that's more human. So I think there's going to be pushback against all of this tech invading our lives, because we're going to come to the realization that, we really need that human contact as part of that. So I think the tech companies that are able to tell their story in that context around, here is something that's amazing that can help you do something, but that doesn't become part of stripping you of your humanity and the wholeness of you as a human being, are going to be the tech companies that are going to be ultimately successful when this counter trend really starts to pick up steam, if that makes sense. So, I mean, you all probably saw the Apple ad that got heavily slammed because of this idea of like crushing all of these old creative tools. People were upset because, and I think that was a signal that says, hey, wait a second, we don't want to lose our humanity in all of this tech. And so that makes people aware to say, hey, with artificial intelligence and all of these different things, wait a second, we want to make sure that we don't let artificial intelligence and tech consume us. We want it to help us be better humans, if that makes sense.
All right. One final question. Do you have one critical piece of advice that you would recommend to aspiring marketers in the tech space?
Yes, I would say, and it would tie into that last point, I would say, don't get so enamored with the technology that you forget why you're creating it. And I think you have to step back and say, how is this going to deeply enhance people's lives as a tool for them to be able to incorporate into what they're doing and what they're trying to achieve, and how that can enhance and reaffirm their humanity? And I think if you start with that question and don't allow yourself to get too enamored with and bought into the tech per se, then you're setting yourself up to be able to create something that's pretty powerful and impactful for consumers, if that makes sense. So I think, it's kind of like in the movies where, if you forget the story, you can have the most incredible CGI, computer generated imaging and graphics, and it doesn't matter. If the story's not there, it's not going to have an impact on people. And so in this case, I really want folks who are doing tech to step back and to ask themselves, or to make sure they divorce themselves from their super interest in the tech per se and the coolness of this thing that it can do, and pull back and say, yeah, that's awesome, and I need to respect that, but I also need to respect how exactly is this going to unlock more latent potential in aspects of humanity. And I think if you bring two of those things together and ask those questions and try to merge those two pieces of thought, I think you're ultimately going to be much more successful in the tech space, because there'll be more and more of a proliferation of these sorts of companies and products and apps and software and things of that nature. So the ability to be able to differentiate and stand out might have a lot to do with your ability to make the argument that what you are doing is actually buttressing humanity, and here's why.
Well, thank you so much. That closes our podcast for today. Thank you so much again, Professor Reed, for joining us. I really valued your insights, and I'm excited for our audience to tune in as well.
Excellent. Appreciate the opportunity.
Stay on top of the latest in identity, marketing, branding, and pop culture by following Americus Reed on social media, or learn more at americusreed.com.